All right, now let's look at some economic data that was good news yesterday that you probably didn't hear in the media or was portrayed as a negative thing because of all the academics that have invaded our society. And that is, we had an increase in the savings rate as of yesterday. So the U.S. savings rate ticked up, I believe it was to 5.8%, which is not bad at all. One of the key factors that I'm looking for as far as the future and investing and whatnot is if the U.S. can sustain a savings rate above 10%. So this line right here, this 10 line, if the U.S. can keep, if American citizens can keep a 10% or more savings rate going forward, that's actually going to set the U.S. up for some significant economic growth. The reason why I base it off of, if you were to look at this Fred data going back to, let's say, the 1960s, you will see that the U.S. savings rate in the 1960s was over 10% all the way until about, what year was this? About 76, 77, okay? Now, I know that economists like Paul Krugman and all of them and all the academics think that everything should happen immediately. But what people don't realize is usually good habits start paying dividends about 10 years later. It takes a decade for you to see the result of good habits, right? Saving money is a good habit. It's not going to give you an immediate return. It just isn't. Okay? Even if savings rate were high, it's the habit that's in the long run that pays off, right? Well, that boom that we had in the 90s and in the late 80s, if you would, was precipitated predominantly by the savings rate of the 60s and the 70s. Okay? That's actually what it was, the later effects of that boom, right? So if the U.S. can get its savings rate above 10% and sustain it above 10%, what that tells me is in 10 to 15, maybe even as much as 20 years, you're going to see a significant economic boom. I am an Austrian economist in the sense that the growth model for most economists is GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. Okay, Austrian economics, the GDP model is very different, or I guess I'm getting this from Dr. Paul Quick, but it is savings leads to investment, and investment leads to capital production, and capital production equals a higher standard of living or an increase in GDP, right? So it all starts with savings, right? When people start building up savings, if you get this to 10%, then they start looking for getting a return on their savings, and that leads to investment. And investment isn't necessarily dumping money into the SPY or the index funds, right? Investment is just, what can I do to increase the return on my money? A lot of times, the most effective way to get an increase or return on your money is to build a product or invest in a product that gives other people a good return. This is the basic concept of the invisible hand, right? So investment then leads to what? That capital production. That's the higher standard of living and the lower cost of living, which then equals a better future, your economic growth. That's what economic growth really is. So that's the Austrian view. It's not a popular view right now, but this is the reason why I look at graphs like the personal savings rate, is because I know what's going to happen 10 years from good behavior. So if this rate can sustain above 10% in the long run, and 5.8% is good. I mean, with oil prices cutting back, it's good to see that consumers are putting more money in savings. If this can be sustained in the long run, that means that actually it's going to be a much better future than, even though everybody's all, it's really easy to be negative, but the idea is that this is actually a positive thing. A 10% savings rate the U.S. desperately needs. The other thing too as well, when you see a collapse or a recession, Americans then can draw back on their savings without draining so much resources from unemployment and everything, which just costs taxpayers and hurts everybody in the long run. So this is a positive thing. You may not have seen this in the news, and I know the academics think there's a paradox of thrift. There is none. It's a habit. You see the dividends from that later on, right? It's not something that gives an immediate return. And John Maynard Keynes was only concerned with the immediate now. That's part of the problem with America, is like it needs to stop thinking about now and what happens 10 years. And that's why Austrian economics is more concerned with what happens over the long run.